Welcome everyone to another edition of Redline TV. It's a pleasure to have you all with us again tonight. We are joined by Pete Furman from the Redline TV team, but also I'm delighted to say Gregor Gall, an academic and writer, activist. His most recent book, which you may have seen trailed in various newspapers online, is on Mick Lynch, the making of a working class hero. And that follows up a recent study on Joe Strummer and Joe Strummer's politics during this period in one of the more and most celebrated punk bands, politicised punk bands, of course, The Clash, which will be a favourite of many of you out there, I'm sure. So we want to focus on the working class movement, the trade union movement, as it approaches a general election and coming out a period of heightened militancy over 2023. And we want to find out what Gregor makes of that, what achievements it managed to record, how it relates to the next Labour government, and I will squeeze in something hopefully towards the end on Joe Strummer. So looking forward to chatting with Pete and Gregor. I hope you enjoyed too, comrades. So welcome, Gregor. Fantastic to see you here, and welcome, Pete, from the RLTV editorial team. We're here obviously mainly to talk about the trade union movement, Gregor, as we approach a general election year. We're in that year now, obviously. And your book in particular takes stock of at least around Mick Lynch, of that period of trade union militancy that we're just kind of emerging from, I guess. And I was doing, as I was kind of prepping and doing a wee bit of reading and watching you on YouTube today, and having read your work elsewhere, Gregor, I came across quite an interesting formulation of how you summarise, if it is a summary of Mick Lynch's and the RMT's achievements over the last year, where you describe Lynch as achieving the power two, which is a kind of form of disruption, I guess, of the status quo and of the kind of narrative around strike action and trade union membership, but not quite achieving power over. And forgive me if I'm wrong, Gregor, but meaning the ability to actually secure meaningful victories during negotiations in the midst of disputes. Can you describe what, because I guess it's one of your key kind of criticisms of Mick Lynch in the book, that while he did disrupt normal programming, to put it that way, for a period, he didn't quite achieve the traction that the working class section is ultimately looking for.
Yeah. So in the book, obviously, I focus on Mick Lynch as an individual, as the leader, the General Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union. Just one caveat, of course, is that in the book, I do consider the RMT as a democratic union organisation, most obviously alongside Mick Lynch. There are other national officers, Eddie Dempsey being effectively the Deputy General Secretary, but there's also a lay national executive. They work full-time for 3 years. They're seconded from their work. So just a kind of health warning that although I focus on Mick Lynch, it's not to exclusion of all the other individuals and players in the game, if you like. But in terms of what you said about the distinction between power to and power over, I think you're right in the way you characterised it. The summer, late June of 2022, if you like, were the glory days when Mick Lynch took down Piers Morgan, Richard Madeley, and others in interviews that were really quite stunning.
What will picketing involve?
Well, you can see what picketing involves. I can't believe this line of questioning.
For a number of years, we'd never had union leaders who had that level of profile, that level of being able to not only articulate an argument, but to connect that with so many people, particularly in making what were essentially sectional arguments into more generalized arguments. And I think that's something that, I and others obviously take our hats off to with regard to Mick Lynch. He had certain advantages. If you like, the RMT was first out of the traps. The CWU, led by Dave Ward, came slightly later, and then many others later on. So Mick Lynch had the first opportunity and obviously took it very well. But then as the two national disputes dragged on, And one was settled in April of this year, last year, 2023. The other one was settled in November 2023. The results of those two disputes, I think there's quite a difference between what you would have expected given what happened in June 2022 and then the results themselves. And to go back to your point, yes, the power to disrupt was there, not just in terms of the narrative, but obviously the power to disrupt the rail network. But that did not lead to power over the bargaining opponent, being the government and also the train operating companies. Network Rail is owned by the government, and the train operating companies are indemnified by the government in terms of their management contracts so that they don't lose money when the strikes go on. Now, listeners presumably will be interested in Mick Lynch and the RMT, but they'll also be interested in how the union movement overall has done since the Summer of Solidarity in 2022. And I would say that the same distinction between power to and power over also applies to them, because other than in a few cases of relatively small numbers of workers who are Unite members who went on strike for long periods of time, often discontinuous action, and were paid strike pay of about £70 a day. Other than those few examples, I would say to yourself and others in the union movement, because I know, Mike, that you're a EIS fella activist, I would say to you and others that, unfortunately, the promise of the renewal and revitalization of the union movement didn't come to pass in terms of looking at the outcomes of the disputes, particularly in terms of, did the pay rises that were gained, which obviously were higher than were initially offered, but did they meet or exceed the level of inflation at the time? And as I say, very, very few did. So it was an inspiring time when we look back on it, but also we have to be hard-headed enough to think, let's not think that we're back in the 1970s, because unfortunately we're not. I wish we were.
Just before Pete comes in, sorry, Pete, I just wanted to quickly follow that up. Gregor, what were the limitations as you see them of those trade union disputes? They made, to a degree, ideological inroads because, as you say, they disrupted the narrative, but that didn't lead to actual concrete victories. So where's the disjunction? What were the limitations, do you think, of the way those disputes were pursued?
Well, again, I think the RMT, in both its national disputes with Network Rail and the train operating companies, is a good illustration of a wider picture. So in both of those disputes, there were many, many strikes. When you put them together, they amount to probably about 3 working weeks altogether. But they were very much split up, very much sporadic. Sometimes they were called off, and they didn't build up a kind of head of steam. There was essentially too much time between the different strikes. So you didn't get a sense of escalation. Now, in the case of the RMT, one of the reasons why that escalation didn't happen was because RMT members, particularly and the train operating company members, who have less leverage over the network. Essentially, when the signallers go on strike, about 90% of the network is closed down. When the train guards and so on the train operating companies, when they go on strike, only about 40 to 50% of trains don't run. So there's a difference in bargaining leverage. But particularly the train operating company RMT members, they needed to know that if they were going to escalate their action, then they weren't going to lose financially from that. Now, the only way to square that circle is if a union has a national strike fund, which is commensurate with the level of members and the amount of action that's going to be taken. And I say in the book, the Mick Lynch book, that the RMT has stocks and shares of in excess of £25 million, and it knew this dispute was coming. And what it should have done, in my view, is sell those stocks and shares in order to raise the money to have millions of pounds worth available to basically fund the strikes. It didn't do that. Therefore, its members were telling the national leadership, the RMT, Lynch included, that they were unwilling to do as much as some others would say they were doing. And I think that same lesson can be applied elsewhere. Yes, Unite, as I've mentioned, has a strike fund which has always amounted to between 25 and 35 million pounds. Other unions, PCS, did start a levy on its members, the sort of non-striking members, if you like, to support striking members. Unison does pay strike pay of around £70 a day, but most of those other examples, other than Unite, they are means tested, as in strike pay isn't automatic, and it doesn't necessarily start from day one. So those are the kind of lessons that need to be learned, because when union members realise that victories are not going to become, not going to be really swift, not going to be very quick, and they're asked to take escalating action, then we need to treat them as people who've got mortgages, rent, families, to put food on the table, all that sort of stuff. We have to be able to have strategies as union activists, socialists, and unions that say, "Don't worry, you will not lose all your wages." And I think that's the key lesson I would suggest from the disputes. One other one, if I may quickly say, is that public sector disputes have always been essentially political disputes. Public sector employers don't suffer the loss of profits from strike action. So you need to be able to approach the issue politically. The problem that unions have had is the Labour Party, and specifically the Labour Party leadership. Keir Starmer has not been willing to support the strikes, and therefore the strikes haven't become more politicised than they already were, because he's not saying, Prime Minister's Question Time every Wednesday to Richie Sunak or his predecessors, why aren't you settling these strikes? Why aren't you giving in to the demands, essentially? What he does say is, of course, I don't want the strikes to happen. There may be, good reasons for the strikes happening, but they still shouldn't happen, and everybody should get back to the negotiating table. Well, that doesn't develop the political pressure on the government to settle those disputes. And again, it's not an easy one to resolve in the here and now, but I think knowing that that is a major challenge has got to be one of the first things that we realise as union activists.
Gregor, on not a different tack at all, but in terms of the settlements that different unions got, I wonder what you thought of the CWU Royal Mail one. I mean, I'm a retired postal worker, and I'm of the opinion that it was total sellout. But I wondered what your view was and why you think that happened. And bearing in mind that Royal Mail isn't public sector, Royal Mail is private sector. And of course, the company came in with, they're basically broke, etc. And I mean, my view is that union leadership had no answer to that, that they caved in response to that. But also I think there's the angle in a lot of the disputes that union leaderships use the workforce, the strikers, as a stage army almost. So you will be up day X, you will have little input into actually sort of not just when the strikes, but the discussion of the offers, certainly no part in any of the negotiations and so on. So often the negotiations are very much removed from those who are actually the frontline workers, which is why sort of all sorts of conditions can get sold out, because people negotiating don't see the same importance to them as the people who work them. So I wondered what your take is on those things, and very much on the sort of the stage army type approach, and unions. I mean, it's true very much of the CWU. It's true to a certain extent of the rail unions that they don't link up much with each other. It's very much a view that we can do it on our own.
I think the result of the CWU Royal Mail dispute is not only similar in terms of, or it doesn't necessarily stand out as being certainly any better than all the other resolution of disputes, with the exception of some in the Unite, with the Unite Union in the likes of transport. I also would venture, having studied the CWU and the Royal Mail a number of years ago, that the result of the dispute there was in line with previous national disputes. That is to say, it wasn't an outright victory. I'm not sure it was, an outright. Well, I'm sure it wasn't an outright defeat either. It lies somewhere in between. But I don't think it was, given that it could have been this time round because of all the other action that was taking place. I don't think it was a result that was any better than the previous settlements in Royal Mail. So what I see in Royal Mail is that the union has always been in a difficult situation where the company has pleaded poverty, company has pleaded that it's losing market share to other competitors. And the issue there is that if you're to deal with the company, then of course one of the issues you'd have to deal with is taking it back into public ownership. Now that's a campaign that obviously the CWU has fought for a number of years. How well it's fought, how energetically it's fought would be an issue that would be open for discussion. I think the other aspect that stands out in the CWU Royal Mail dispute is that in no other sector was there such large-scale victimization rather of the lay workplace union representatives. And it took a very, very long time for most of those lay representatives to secure some kind of settlement that was adequate, whether it was reinstatement or some kind of payoff. Now, I think that is a major problem for the CWU because essentially your frontline organisers have been decapitated, and that inevitably must weaken your ability to organise action in the workplace. Those are, your key foot soldiers, if you like, NCOs at the workplace level. And I think that the CWU took too long to gain an adequate settlement in that particular aspect of the dispute. So I think that although there are particular aspects in terms of the kind of history and current situation of Royal Mail with the CWU, it does again speak to a wider situation. In all unions in Britain at the moment, the balance between the national officers and the lay local elected officials is a very much different one from how it was 30 or 40 years ago. Essentially, power and influence has shifted towards those at the centre who are employed by the union, and it has drained away from those who are in the workplace, who are the kind of obvious face to their fellow members of the union. Now, there are various reasons for that, and I'm not sure that we have time to go into all that. There are different takes on it. Some would suggest that it's a deliberate strategy of the national union officials to take that influence away. Others would suggest there are environmental factors, such as the anti-union laws that have effectively centralised the operation of unions because of the way that the balloting system for industrial action works. Whatever the result of it is, or whatever the cause of it is, the result is that you can see that too often there was that sense that union members were about to go on strike, and all of a sudden, literally the day before or even that evening before the strike was due to take place, it was called off. Called off with, in most cases, I would say, insufficient reason, as in it was an offer of further talks without any definite improved offer. Quite often, the offer of further talks was not a genuine one. It did not lead to a breakthrough, and therefore that sense that people had to, regird their loins to get ready to strike again was there. And I don't think that's a sensible way to conduct an industrial dispute, where you need to know that people are behind you when you call the action, or you let them call the action, let everybody else know that their fellow men are behind it, and you move together as one. Whereas when you have that situation of action being called off at short notice without clear improvements in the offer, I think will inevitably demoralise people, including the activists. So I think it would clearly demoralise the union members who are less engaged and less class conscious or union conscious within their own union. But it would certainly help to also undermine the confidence of the activists, the very activists that are necessary to spread the message and organise the action in the workplace come the strike itself. So I think these are problems which are not necessarily new to the union movement in Britain, but they're ones that came into much sharper focus in the strikes that we've had since. I think one of the lessons of the rail dispute and others is that the left itself is insufficiently large and well organised in most unions. In many unions, the left has become, the kind of cadre of national union officials, and therefore we need although it's not easy, we need to see a sort of reflowering of grassroots rank and file organisers and activists at that workplace level. There was an attempt in the RMT union called Change Course, but it basically was stillborn, it was embryonic. In other unions, we're seeing a kind of revolt, albeit after the actions taking place. I suppose the bright spots the within other unions are in the likes of Unison and in the BMA, and a little bit in the RCN. But those are only a small number of unions amongst many more. So there are serious lessons and a lot of work that needs to be done by union activists in the period from now until the next big battles happen.
In terms of the RMT, there's an interesting development in that. I mean, the branch secretary of a local RMT national rail branch towards the end of that dispute described it to me as sort of, well, just a never-ending strike every week or every 2 weeks, and really wasn't going anywhere. The contrast is that the RMT strike that's coming up this week on London Transport is essentially all out for a week. Whereas, I mean, in the previous tube strikes over their pensions, it was one strike every 8 weeks. And I wondered if there's some sort of recognition of the failure of the previous strategy, or what lies behind that, if you've got any thoughts on that.
I don't know the particular reason for why the strike strategy for next week, or the tactic rather, because it's not a strategy in itself. I don't know why that tactic is now coming into play. However, I would suggest it's a positive development, because essentially you have the ability of the same number of workers to make more of an impact on the underground network by striking on different days. I do in the book and in other things I've written about the RMT, I have suggested that, for example, a similar kind of more selective action, more considered action could have been taken. So, for example, you could go back to, seems to be going back a long way, but you could go back to the Drive for 35, which was an engineering workers' strike in the late 1980s, where a levy was instituted on all union members, and it was used to pay to keep certain engineering factories out on strike for many weeks at a time. Now, in some of the writings I've done about the RMT, what I've said is that you could have a situation where all the signallers on the mainline intercity routes went on indefinite strike, and their wages were paid both by the National Strike Fund of the union that needs to be created, but also by the non-striking signallers. And that would have had a disproportionate impact. The non-striking signallers would have been the ones that would have been employed, say, for example, on the rural routes or the not such big, rail lines. That kind of thinking does, I think, need to be taken up elsewhere. The only real innovations that you can see in the RMT strikes were striking on, for example, a Wednesday and a Friday, or say a Monday and a Wednesday, so that essentially the Tuesday or the Thursdays are affected, because that would mean that the trains were in the wrong places at the wrong time. So your action extends over and above the actual strike day itself. So that kind of lesson would obviously be different in different workplaces, different sectors of the economy. But I don't think it was widely enough used in the two national disputes that the RMT conducted. And so it is welcome that this new tactic is being used next week on the underground. However, whether it will be enough to take the dispute forward in terms of gaining the RMT's bargaining demands remains to be seen, because in previous strikes on the underground, as with on the two national rail strikes, action was called off at short notice without, say, much in the way of improvements. And so we've yet to see whether the underground dispute will escape, if you like, the clutches of what happened to the two national rail disputes.
Hey, Gregor, can I put a question to you both? It's something that inevitably we're going to reflect on, so I'm interested in what your thoughts are. that period that we're talking about of consistent disputes right across sectors, heightened militancy, it was exciting, wasn't it? I mean, however we look back on it, it was a really exciting period. And whether you were directly involved in your own workplace or whether you were joining picket lines and seeing quite mixed picket lines as well, not just the trade union movement, but community campaigns and others joining in. I'm interested in your thoughts on what the legacy, the political legacy of that might be, and in particular, how you think those strikes and that wave of disputes has, or if it has, changed the political ground that the Labour Party as a government, as a likely government towards the end of this year, is going to find itself on. Has it changed that ground? Is the Labour government going to find itself in a different circumstance than it would have been had those strikes not gone ahead?
I think undoubtedly the hand of the union movement is a lot stronger going into a Starmer-led Labour government. But unfortunately, and I'm sure we would agree amongst ourselves here, that doesn't mean that the union movement is going to be able to leverage out the kind of things that it wants to see, even taking, if you like, the TUC's kind of demands about employment rights from day one and so on. And although it's been repeated, and Angela Rayner has made a fist of this, that, for example, the Trade Union Act and the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act will be repealed within the first 100 days. And I hope, obviously, that is going to be the case, although I suppose it'll be subject to the parliamentary timetable and things like that. We shouldn't fool ourselves that if those two acts of parliament are removed, that suddenly everything is going to be okay. It's not, because those are only the last two in a long, long line of anti-union acts, and there are many more issues that we would want to see change. So I think the union movement as a whole, and certain voices within it, like Matt Rack from the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, I think those voices will be stronger and more confident, but whether that will be, so it's necessary that those voices are stronger and more confident, but whether they will be sufficient, I think very much remains open to doubt. I think it's an interesting example is that on the 9th of December last year, there was a first special trade union congress, if you like, the first TUC conference, special conference that was held since the early 1980s. Both that one last December and the one in 82 were over what the TUC and the union movement was going to do about fighting anti-union laws, in this case, the strikes minimum service level. And the reason I think it's interesting is that all the rhetoric was pretty good. The union movement will come together and take action if one union member is sacked for refusing to go into work when they are compelled to do so by law. But I think when it comes to the crunch, whether the union movement will be able to deliver that, whether it even be willing to deliver that, is going to come into play. And I think that's, though not the same in terms of how the union movement will directly relate to a Starmer-led government, I think it does show that the possibility exists that even though all the right things are said, when push comes to shove, the union movement will either not know how to translate those words into action under a Labour government, or it will choose not to do so. And it may choose not to do so because Starmers may say, well, come on, give me time. We're only just into government. The situation that I've inherited is much, much worse than the one that Tony Blair inherited. The economy back in the late 90s was growing. That's not the case with Starmer. The level of public debt is much higher. All those arguments will be used to say, look, there's only so much I can do, or even if I do nothing, that's what you're just going to have to accept at this point in time. So there are differences. We are clearly in a better situation in terms of the union movement going into a future Labour government, but it's far from a rosy picture. And I think just as a kind of final comment, 2022 actually saw the union movement lose 200,000 members. We would expect during the period of strikes, particularly those that were not defeats, that union membership would increase. It didn't. We won't know the figures for 2023 until May of this year, 2024. But it's just a little salutary warning that everything is not going completely the way that we would like it to.
Just on that political relationship, you touched on enough is enough in your Guardian piece, and I think that's quite a crucial, development that became a non-development, if you like. I mean, it was a massive opportunity to bring together the unions and campaigns around, however you want to put it, non-workplace issues, because it explicitly talked about housing issues and other issues. And it was massively popular with loads of people signing up quickly. It held big rallies around the country and then was effectively killed off. Now, I know it wasn't political in the sense of it set out to form a new party or anything like that, but it was politically in terms of the pressure and so on, and that would have increased the pressure on the Labour Party for support as well. I wondered if you wanted to expand on what you thought about that experience.
Yes, I think that the launch of Enough is Enough was clearly a positive development. I would say it was, in some ways, it should have been launched earlier, because both the two main unions behind it, the RMT and the CWU, knew they were going into these disputes. It was really only launched in, I suppose, late summer, August 2022, when the disputes had already started. And I think that that's an indication of, if you like, a lack of strategic thinking, that creating something like Enough is Enough was not thought of earlier and was not begun earlier. And I think part of the explanation of why Enough is Enough essentially becomes defunct in early spring or late winter, early spring 2023 is because it's too bound up with those disputes of those two unions, the RMT and the CWU. Unfortunately, for various reasons, it didn't expand beyond that. Yes, Tribune was involved in it. Yes, Acorn was involved in it. Yes, some MPs like Sarah Zoltana were involved in it. But it needed to become wider in order to realise its potential. And I think that, as I say, because it was tied, I think, in my mind, too closely to two unions, it was used in a far too instrumental way to bolster those two unions, the political aspects of their disputes. And when those disputes either ended or moved into a different phase, Enough is Enough didn't seem to fit that view in those two unions. Nonetheless, as we've highlighted, the fact that it was able to sign up between 750,000 and 1 million people in a matter of weeks around 5 basic demands did show, as did the kind of influx into Labour Party after Jeremy Corbyn was elected, or in that time. It does show there is a kind of like a representation gap for certain views, certain progressive left-wing views. The key question that all those initiatives face is, once you've had that initial flush of success, where do you go from there? And most specifically, what do you do with those people? Essentially, it's an issue of mobilization. You can't just expect people to go to rallies in towns and cities and then either be told, well, go and do the same thing back in your own locality. You've got to have a strategy, a work strategy, which obviously there's a consensus for, about what you do with those people, what those people do with themselves, rather than be, told what to do. And the most obvious things would be demonstrations. But again, in order to have a political impact where you gain your objectives, I think we've got to go beyond just saying, let's call a demonstration. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient in themselves. And so I would have said that one of the things that Enough is Enough and other initiatives need to try to do is to understand the relationship between the, if you like, the producers of services, particularly in the public sector, but also elsewhere, the producers of services that we use and rely on, and the users of those services. How do you put the two groups together to make something that's much bigger than itself? Now, I myself don't have any kind of magic solution to that. I think that many of these challenging issues need to be worked out in practice, but I don't get a sense that there was even an attempt to do so with Enough is Enough. We've had various attempts over the years, particularly since austerity began in with the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in 2010, to bring together different groups, say NHS workers with those that use the NHS. I think we need to go back and learn some of those lessons, because under a Starmer-led government, it's clear the financial taps, the purse strings are not going to be loosened or opened up. He's making that absolutely clear now. So it's going to be a hard battle. It's going to be a hard battle evermore because people, even though Starmer is trying to reduce expectations, people will have expectations precisely because it's a Labour government as opposed to a Tory government. Yeah. And therefore, I think the problem is that they may easily become demoralised and disillusioned when, Starmer says no, and they don't seem to have anything to change his mind with. So I think we really need to grapple with these challenges as soon as possible.
Thanks, Gregor. And we're approaching the end of the show, but we couldn't let you go without a wee question on Joe Strummer. Okay. Just for, I'm sure there's a good few viewers who have perhaps of more vintage years even than us three, who had the pleasure of seeing the Clash at one point in the past. And I just wonder, just very quickly, Gregor, whether in terms of Mick Lynch and Joe Strummer, despite them, their different contributions in very different fields being flawed, maybe, or limited in some way, that on aggregate, do you see them still as, the name of your book is The Making of a Working Class Hero. Are they still heroic figures, or is that too much to apply to either of them or either of them?
Personally, I wouldn't characterise either of them as heroes. And in the case of Joe Strummer, he was flawed in terms of his personal relationships, the way he regarded women. There's all that kind of aspect to it. I wouldn't put him on a pedestal. I think anyone that reads the book, The Punk Rock Politics of Joe Strummer, will find that abundantly clear. All that said, I don't think that any of that can take away from the fact that he, like many others, but much more successfully than many others, was able to use music as a way to convey to people radical, progressive, left-wing ideas. He wasn't a revolutionary socialist. He had changing views about the Labour Party. But all that said, put it to one side, there are so many people who got their first kind of sense of what left-wing politics meant through the music of the Clash and later on. And the reason why the book on Mick Lynch is called The Making of a Working Class Hero is not because I think he's a hero. I don't think he's a hero. I think that he has clear qualities in many regards, but I also think he has weaknesses as well, as I've probably alluded to already. But the reason why it's called The Making of a Working Class Hero is because at that time, in late June 2022, and probably for most of the rest of 2022, other people, thousands of them, started calling him a working class hero. Now, that's a pretty specific and unusual term to use in this day and age. Yeah. So what I started off the book was recognizing that that's what people were doing in their thousands, but also trying to understand why it was. John Lennon most famously said a working class hero is something to be. And clearly Mick Lynch at that time, and still to some degree, even though the disputes have ended with not great settlements, is somebody who others look to say certain things that, or to give them a voice when they don't have a voice themselves, to say certain things that they believe in and support, and yet are not being said in the national media on Newsnight and those sort of things. So the book's about that, and I do examine what it means to be a working class hero. The most recent, but a long time ago, working class hero was somebody like Arthur Scargill in the early 1970s when he developed, tactic of flying pickets, but also during the miners' strike 84 to 85. So it's about people recognizing certain traits in others that they value, often when they can't do things themselves. But I do think we need to have a kind of critical faculty here, because we, in a perfect situation, nobody should be a hero, or everybody should be a hero, if you see what I mean, in terms of people being able to stand up and fight for their rights and do so effectively. And that would mean that we would look at other people in a different way, rather than, if you like, put individuals on a pedestal and think that they, as great men or women of history, have the power to do things. I think we need to realise that ultimately working class people do have their own power if they act collectively. And hopefully then, if you like, if we still have to use the term hero, then all the men and women that are workers in the working class in Britain would be heroes and heroines.
Take no heroes. It's a good way to end the show. Gregor, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks.
All the best with the book, and good luck for everything in the future, Gregor. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to both. Thanks for the invite. Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks.